Muy buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Norma Elia Cantu, and I am the Murchison Professor in the Humanities here at Trinity University. And let me find my remarks, which are not on here. My laptop. That's why I couldn't find them. Oh gosh, now I have to log in. Okay, here we go. As I was saying, I am Norma Elia Cantu, and I'm the Murchison Professor. I want to welcome you to the 6th Annual Madrid Lecture on Latino Arts and Symposium. The event has been happening for 6 years, but we took a break because of COVID, of course. I want to remind us that Trinity University is situated on the grounds of what is known as Yanaguana, water spirit, the traditional homelands and territories of the Payaya, a Coahuiltecan group, whose descendants still live on these lands. I thank the spirits of this place that is Trinity University and acknowledge all of our ancestors and ask permission for our event. May all who are here present at the Holt Center and via our YouTube channel gain insight and grow from today's talks and events. I will now introduce you to the person who had the vision of creating this lecture, Professor Arturo Madrid, my predecessor at Trinity. Professor Madrid is the Murchison Professor Emeritus at Trinity. He has written extensively and made public presentations on educational status and artistic and cultural expressions of the Latino populations of the United States. Over the course of his career, he served on numerous national commissions and boards concerned with educational issues, including the 2006 U.S. Secretary of Education's Commission on the Future of Higher Education. In 1996, he was awarded the National Endowment for Humanity's highest honor, the Charles Frankel Prize. And in 2009, he received the John Hope Franklin Award. I first heard of Professor Madrid when I was a graduate student applying for Ford Foundation funding to work on my dissertation. He was heading that organization. During his tenure at Trinity, he was deeply engaged in connecting Trinity faculty, staff, and students with a wide range of San Antonio Latino arts and educational organizations, and with sponsoring programming having to do with Latinos on campus, and as the founding president of an Institute for Policy Studies. After a distinguished career as a federal official, director of a national fellowship program, that's the one I was telling you about, the Ford, and as the founding president of an Institute for Policy Studies, he retired from Trinity in 2016. Professor Madrid?
I'll start by saying that I'm delighted that the tradition that I instituted at Trinity University, which is to start all events on time and not penalize people who show up on time. I'm very pleased, very pleased. I hope you continue to that, Professor Cantu. My dear friend and colleague, Norma Cantu, has given you a little bit of the backdrop of my presence here, but I'll start simply by saying that almost 30 years ago, that is 1 year from now, I died and came not to heaven, but to Trinity University, to San Antonio, and to Texas. And it was a rather extraordinary set of events and occurrences that made possible my presence here and my engagement not only with Trinity University, but with the San Antonio community and the Texas community at large. And in the process, I was able to draw and encourage many colleagues to come to Trinity. Many of you know Professor Rita Urquijo Ruiz here, who came here after my being here. Katsu Nashimura as well came here. There are any number of other people who followed me here. Others who had preceded me moved on, but I stayed here for 23 years and kept encouraging students and faculty and staff to move through the works. The good fortune that I had was that shortly after I arrived here, and I was given a charge, which is to connect Trinity to the larger Latino community of San Antonio and Texas. I was named to a corporate board. It was one of my board members who had served on the Tomas Rivera Center, the Institute for Policy Studies. He invited me to serve on his board. And when I retired from that board, he made a gift to Trinity University and asked me to determine what it would be used for. Determination whether it would be used to celebrate Latino artists and Latino art. And so with the arrival of my successor, I am now no longer distinguished, but extinguished. She established this lectureship and has proceeded to not only invite very distinguished artists, there's writers and poets and musicians and others to come to Trinity and present this lecture, but also organized a symposium and produced publications that document those. And so I'm very honored to be here and to greet you. My wife will be here shortly. Between the two of us, we've made additional contributions to the fund, and now it is a very robust fund and permits us to do this event yearly and provide transportation and housing and a modest honorarium to our guests. So thank you, Dr. Cantu, for this honor. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Professor Madrid. Not only is he a good friend and a colleague, but he's also my neighbor. He actually lives down the hall from me. Es un honor. And now I would like to introduce, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Megan Mustain, our Vice President for Academic Affairs, our Provost. She oversees all academic programs as well as the academic budget, and my computer just died, and contributes significantly to Trinity University's vision and strategic goals. She develops and mentors faculty and professional staff in academic affairs, including Coates Library, the Trinity University Press, whose books, by the way, are back there, athletics, and the registrar. She is our new academic leader, and we are very, very pleased that she is here with us. She hasn't even been at Trinity a year. It's only a few months. So thank you very much, Megan Mustain.
Thank you so much. That's very kind. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Trinity University to the 6th annual Madrid Lecture and Symposium. Trinity is honored to welcome literary luminaries, spotlighting writers and scholars who invite us to encounter and re-encounter each other and the world. Located as we are in San Antonio, a city that has been at the heart of Latino letters for over 100 years, we are proud to spotlight this creative legacy. Trinity has hosted Sandra Cisneros' Macondo Writers Workshop, and I'm thrilled to announce here to everyone here and virtually here that Macondo will once again come to Trinity virtually this summer in 2022 and in person in 2023. With today's event, we honor Trinity's own Murchison Distinguished Professor Emeritus, Dr. Madrid, who continues to play such an important role in making, marking, and celebrating Latino arts in San Antonio and beyond. Today, you are all in for a real treat. May you have a transformative and insightful gathering. Thank you.
And next, we begin our symposium, and I'm going to call one of my students from the creative writing class, Samantha Rodriguez, to come and introduce our first speaker.
Our first speaker, Doctora Cordelia Barrera, is an associate professor of English at Texas Tech University, who received her PhD at the University of Texas in San Antonio. She specializes in Latinx literatures, the American Southwest, and multi-ethnic speculative fiction. Her work concentrates on the literature of social justice and the environment. Her book, The Haunted Southwest, Towards an Ethics of Place in Borderlands Literature, makes use of theories of place, space, and haunting to show how memories instills an ethic and orientation tied to embodied knowledge in the US-Mexico borderlands. Please join me in introducing Doctora Barrera.
All right, she showed me. Yes, you need to go to the PowerPoint.
That one, right there. All right, and then that.
You can.
I think I am a Mac person, so
There.
no. Oh, I did it wrong. Okay. Whoops.
This one right here. One more. There. Click. There it is.
There we go. Thank you all for being here, and thank you so much for inviting me. The title of my paper is called Shaping an Ecological Consciousness in the Work of Helena Maria Viramontes. I was really excited to be asked by one of my favorite people in the world, Norma Cantu, to be part of this symposium on the enduring legacy of the work of Helena Maria Viramontes. Likely, like many of us, I began my graduate work in Chicana and Chicanx, borderlands literature, with novels like Under the Feet of Jesus and collections like The Moths and Other Stories. But it was with the publication of Their Dogs Came With Them that I began to coalesce ideas related to the politics of space and place in her work. And just as Gabriela Gutierrez y Mus, Rebosos de Palabras, seeks to fill a necessary void in Viramontes' scholarship in her creative work, so too does my discussion today strive to fill a gap. This gap is a bridge, a gateway by which we might connect Viramontes' work to wider mainstream audiences. The link is environmental or eco-critical studies, an area of scholarship that has been touched upon by various scholars. Today, then, I want to talk about Viramontes' work with a fairly wide brush that focuses attention on the ways she interrogates eco-critical and environmental issues in her work, specifically how she challenges persistent modern or modernist narratives of manifest destiny. For example, Barbara Cook, in a very early treatment of eco-critical issues by women writers in the American Southwest, describes the antithetical desires of the status quo for a new Edenic American landscape on the one hand, and the right to exploit that very landscape for economic gain on the other. Cook describes how Viramontes, like Ana Castillo, Linda Ogan, Leslie Mormon Silko, shape compelling counter-narratives to critique destructive patterns of modernity and coloniality that call attention to regional issues while linking those to wider environmental issues and concerns. Before I touch on eco-critical issues in Viramontes' work, it's helpful to understand how Chicana and Chicano and Mexican-American environmentalism differs from mainstream US eco-criticism and environmentalism. For instance, Laura Pulido describes how mainstream US environmentalism is often concerned with narrowly defined quality of life issues. In early works of US environmental writings, individuals, whether authors themselves or literary protagonists, and we can think of the works of like Edward Muir and Thoreau, often remove themselves from an urban locale of everyday social contexts and concerns to the realm of nature. In nature, one is isolated or distanced, so to speak, from contemporary technologies and economic developments. Let's make sure I can do this. In US environmental writings, the human spirit, once disassociated from an urbanized setting, becomes free to disengage from constructs of self-determination born of a spirit of manifest destiny that underscores progress and development in terms of land ownership and the civilizing transformation of so-called empty spaces. And in this way, we see how individuals become isolated from both nature itself and modernizing impacts. This ideal remains at the heart of our national park system. It reinforces a dualistic separation of humans from nature. Conversely, Priscilla Solis Ibarra reminds us how Chicana and Chicano environmental writing exhibits a steady consciousness of colonization as well as a continuing awareness of an ever-evolving ethnic identity. In Chicana and Chicano and Mexican-American environmental writing, themes that emerge often and generally engage a social justice agenda, the legacy of the Mexican Revolution, and the political ecology of dispossession. Devin Peña has written extensively about how Chicanos and Chicanos and other people of color, including indigenous nations that once roamed their U.S. native lands freely, have fostered and maintained a relationship with the natural world. Peña describes this, quote, land ethic as one in which the natural world, the landscape, la tierra, is a member of the community of life, and as such worthy of respect and protection. I think the most significant difference he describes between these two strains of environmentalism is how Chicanas and Chicanos tend to define nature as homeland and not as resources or wilderness. And this is important because this idea affirms our shared fate, the shared fate of Chicanas and Mexicanas with the land, rather than destructive patterns of modernity and coloniality that reify a human nature split and further prioritize individualist patterns of possession. We can further follow Walter Mignolo's term, delinking, to see how Viramontes delinks from an abstract faith in modern values to engage the landscape as an active subject rather than a passive object. In so doing, she further embeds the familiar feminist strategy of seeking to, quote, transcend the colonial concept of possession, end quote. And this is important because when we move beyond possession, whether of landscape or physical bodies, we begin to tear at the fabric, as does Viramontes, of discourses of progress and modernity that fracture, disembody, and displace. In Under the Feet of Jesus and Their Dogs Came With Them, Viramontes begins with geographical displacement, space, only to move towards displacements and erasures of individual bodies. And so we have Perfecto, wanting desperately to return home, the whole time, quote, stumbling over his memories like a child learning to walk, memories that bound his spirit to his native soil, end quote. Mothers like Petra, who fear children born sin labios. Young girls like Estrella, who wonder about those who have labored for others before her, how they get sucked into an earth, and these are those tar pits, so far from their native soil, only to have, quote, no details, no life left behind, no piece of cloth, no ring, no doll, a few bits of bone displayed under a glass case, and nothing else. And finally, there's Alejo, who's effectively erased. No fingerprint, no history, no story, family, bone. Erased by a toxicity chain that not only degrades the environment, but bodies. And this speaks to not just his body, but the fracturing of entire communities within a system that sees them only as commodities. Is this what happens, young Estrella asked? People just use you until you're all used up? In Under the Feet of Jesus, Viramontes appeals with us to reckon with what the dark underbelly of the American dream has wrought for those who labor within a system wherein the measure of one's worth is determined by what the body produces, reminding us of how the body becomes an appendage of capital. In the novel, Estrella comes to understand how her body, like Alejo's and her mother's and all those who labor under the relentless glare of a blinding white sun over vast monotonous fields without beginnings or endings, is nothing more than a commodity, a working body, as described by David Harvey and others. Working bodies produce capital and exchange labor with the capitalist system via the commodity produced. In this transaction between capitalism and the body of a worker, the basic condition of the contract assumes that the capitalist has the right to produce a disciplined body for production according to what the worker produces. And so when Alejo, with his love of history, reminds Estrella, if we don't have oil, we don't have gasoline, the seeds are sown for a reader's understanding of the intimate connection between hidden labor and the human costs of that labor, of production. Moreover, Alejo imagines himself as an aspect of the landscape, and this is a quote. He believed himself to be a solid mass of boulder thrust out of the earth and not some particle lost in an infinite and cosmic space. With a simple touch of a hand, he not only became part of the earth's history, but would exist as the boulders did for eternity. Alejo's belief contradicts the capitalist assumptions of landscape as devoid of meaning, as unoccupied space to be filled, further conjuring Sherry Moraga's sentiment that land remains the common ground for all radical action. Alejo's story does not end when we leave him at the clinic. It goes on as Viramontes superposes plot time and mythic time to embed an inclusive timelessness that continues to shape the lived experiences of the present. This mirrors the approach of Chicana feminists like Gloria Ansaldúa, Emma Perez, and Chela Sandoval, who take a postmodern approach to examining gaps and specific moments of history from various points of view in efforts to interrupt linear, Eurocentric models of thinking and, consequently, writing history. Following Edward Soja, we see how Alejo is not simply located within one time period, but a broader encompassing historical sequence. What roots Alejo, what orients him, is a land vision that precedes capitalism and the white conquerors. Alejo's thoughts illustrate a land ethic that anchors place to the construction of his identity alongside a wider community. His likely death is linked to a rhetoric of modernity that fractures and denaturalizes identities and communities via the artificial, the unnatural, and the colonizing. But his interior consciousness delinks these modern abstractions. And taking a cue from Alejo's interior consciousness during the climactic scene at the clinic, Estrella recalls Alejo's story of the La Brea tar pits, conceptualizing, again, how bones made oil and oil made gasoline. And just as it's their bones that keeps the rude white nurse's car going, so too do their bones become one with the earth itself as well as Earth's history, existing as do boulders and stones for eternity. The late New Mexican poet Sabine Ulibarri encapsulates the significance of la tierra, the land, to Mexican Americans and Tejanas and Tejanos. In the award-winning PBS documentary, Chicana, Quest for a Homeland, he says, "The land was sacred because your parents and grandparents were buried there. Some of your children were buried there, and you would be buried there. The sweat, blood, and tears of generations have filtered into the land, so it is holy, sacred, sacrosanct." Ulibarri speaks to an ethical connection to place, what Raymond Williams calls a structure of feeling that returns to past traditions and places of origin as a basis and orientation for continued belief. Ulibarri's sentiment conjures a collective past, recognizing the claims others, our ancestors, have upon our bodies in the present. When profits eclipse environmental protections, we are forced to reckon with how constructs of power both create national mythologies and define groups of people. For Chicanas and Chicanos and Mexican Americans, the collision of identity and place, along with the uses of territory, is often a central character. The nomadic quality of characters in Under the Feet of Jesus, who occupy various transitory rural spaces, mirrors the isolation and displacement of main protagonists in Their Dogs Came With Them. And a through line that connects these two novels is a critique of capitalist progress and modernity. Alisa Munoz describes this construct as a geography of pain. But she also writes about how Latina and Latino communities counter and resist such impacts of modernity by forming what she describes as independent spatial meanings. Chicana scholarship is rife with theorizations of these spatial landscapes, as Mary Pat Brady, Maria Herrera Sobek, Priscilla Ibarra, Laura Pulido, Devin Peña, and so many others have written about. In Dogs, Viramontes further illustrates human relationships as bound within the ecosystems they inhabit. Throughout the novel, we wander alongside our various protagonists through space and time to underscore how we recreate the past with an eye towards the future within the present. Munoz describes how humans are aligned with landscape in Dogs, and how the displacement of landscape in the novel mirrors the human displacement of East LA residents in the 1960s. Dogs tends to isolate characters in their own private worlds in seemingly separate plot strands to further mirror the containment and isolation that freeway construction and the quarantine authority have brought to East LA. But the protagonist's stories, like the persistent specks of dust that litter the novel, are not free-floating, but tethered to residual traces of things lost. These traces, born from the wreckage caused by earthquakes and earth movers, coalesce in the interface between past and future, known and unknown. And although the various characters' stories eventually converge, this amalgamation, this more complete picture that we as readers finally comprehend, does little to compensate for the material losses of displacement wrought by the construction of the highway. What links our main characters is the fractured nature of their world. And these fractures, these traces, are signifiers for ecological abuses that occur through time. Just as migrant workers bear the physical, emotional, and historical costs of the increasingly demanding logic of a capitalist system where gross domestic product is directly aligned with environmental devastation, so too must the protagonists of Their Dogs Came With Them sacrifice both their histories and their bodies within what Viramontes describes as a second conquest in East LA in the 1960s, with the building of the freeway. In the novel, fractured and displaced bodies are directly correlated to a city analogous to a mutilated body. Here, lives rent asunder by a capitalist vision of growth are like so many streets that have been, quote, amputated into stumped dead ends, end quote. The fractured city, a mirror of an earlier historical displacement in which the character, Chavela, soon herself to be a, quote, phantom limb in Mama's memory, recalls mundane fragments of her past, shoes without shoelaces, flowered curtains without windows, a baby rattle without seeds in its hollow belly, an arm without a body. That was a quote. Just as the earthquake from an earlier period destroys but also discloses such remnants, so too do the contemporary bulldozers with their muzzles and sharpened metal teeth draw our attention to what is no longer there, to what has been lost. East LA is humanized, described as a living but mutilated body. And although aspects of the physical landscape are made to seemingly disappear through a system of modernity that overlooks and erases as living systems are transformed into infrastructure, characters don't disappear. They remain, although in tatters and in disrepair. Oops. Whoops, whoops. Oh, so sorry. Oh. Let me see if I can get back there. Just because that's nice. That's probably the... And I think I got there a little early. Ama, this is a quote, Ama was part of the house, carelessly repaired with cardboard and duct tape like her cracked windows. Frank was part of the house, a loose, exposed wire, ready to electrocute anyone who touched him. Turtle, too, is described as being there all along, like a crack on the sidewalk. The continuity between memory and erasure is a necessary and subversive tool for the survival of the community. And when we look beneath the surface of a literal ecology of death in East LA, beyond its ties to a global economic culture, we find life. We find resistance in tatters, cracked, and possibly even reduced to rubble, but a lifeline nonetheless. And so we are left with Estrella hoisting herself up a long chain with calloused hands and a heart, quote, powerful enough to summon home all those who have strayed, end quote. And we have Tranquilina, who moves forward, refusing the commands of the status quo, resisting to the bitter end, past the, quote, Caesarean scars of the earth, towards a place of possibility, because the body remembers. And so in both novels, we are left with hope amidst hopelessness, but only when we look beyond and below. For it's here that we locate competing discourses of knowledge that do not fracture, but assert and center forms of social and environmental justice that are historically situated and aligned with the critical consciousness that reifies a politics born of necessity and grounded in the lived experiences of entire communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barrera. I have to confess that I'm very, very proud about Cordelia. She was my undergraduate student in Laredo, long time ago, and then a PhD student here at UTSA, so I'm very, very proud of her. And she's now a professor at Texas Tech University and doing amazing work. Her new book is just out and already getting good reviews. Thank you. Our next speaker is going to be introduced by another of our creative writing students, Esmeralda Pedrosa.
It is now my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Mary Pat Brady. She is a professor of English and Latinx Studies at Cornell University, the author of Scales of Captivity, Racial Capitalism, and the Latinx Child, hot off the presses from Duke. Mary Pat is also the author of the award-winning Extinct Lands, Temporal Geographies, Chicana Literature, and the Urgency of Space. Also from Duke, she is an associate editor of the Health Anthology and editor of the Gale Guide to the U.S. Literature. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Mary Pat Brady.
Wow. I want to say many thank yous, but I first want to say it's daunting to follow that beautiful talk. Yes. So thank you for that lovely, lovely lecture. Thank you, Norma, for arranging this incredible event. And I know Helena asked me today to send her love. She's sorry she's not here in person. And I want to just say that it's just a great privilege to be here. And I hope that what I have to say will be helpful to you, but I suspect many of you will not be surprised by it. I offer this talk today as both an homage and a confession. I've had the great good pleasure of working with Professor Helena Maria Viramontes since 1999, and my confession is this, that nearly every tactical error I have made navigating the great theater, that is a big English department in the Northeast, is a result of failing to listen to Helena. That's my confession. Every time I've been too tapada, too terca, to listen to her, things go badly. So what follows is not a report on those missteps, they're stupid and they're boring, but an effort to describe a little of what Helena brings to the table as a professor, a mentor, a friend, a Chicana colleague committed to a Chicanx feminist pursuit of social justice and liberation. And what I'll do is then kind of tie that to her writing. Helena Maria Viramontes' fiction is filled with moments of teaching, moments where one person helps another navigate the world, shows another how to learn. In her fiction, education is not about institutions, it is about making possibilities, as nurturing the discipline of hope, It's about creating pathways for liberation and social transformation. Education is about opening doors between worlds. Consider this beautiful moment in her early story, The Broken Web, which is in the Moths. This story of violence and secrets concludes with these lines. Do you hear the crickets? Our mother warned us against killing crickets because they are the souls of condemned people. Now, given that this story of violence, the comment could be meant ironically, and I think it probably is referring back to what's happened, but it's also a moment in which Viramontes calls our attention to the work, to the labor of listening. After all, The Broken Web begins with a hungry priest who is tired of listening to confessions. So if we listen, what can the crickets tell us? What did we hear our mothers teach us? What is our relationship to their song and her warning? This, I think, is where Helena takes us. It's this work of listening and understanding listening as a kind of gift that is also a form of labor that threads its way across Helena's fiction. Listening as gift and as labor, just as it is the cost of listening, but failing to hear, that sounds a warning from the moths to under the feet of Jesus to their dogs came with them. So I want to begin with this first lesson, listening as the first principle of pedagogy and collegiality. As a colleague, as a director of creative writing, Helena is the first person to listen to everyone. She always wants to really pay attention to what people are saying. She makes it a point to attend to everyone's point of view. It can make for slow-going decisions when no one, however unruly or disconnected, is ignored. Time and again, I've watched Helena ask one person and then another, but what do you think? And then she really listens, because she begins from an assumption about the dignity of people, an assumption that is a commitment to liberation. So back briefly to my confession. For what Helena always says when a dispute emerges, when a power play starts to unfold that I've stupidly gotten tangled in, is, Mija, talk to them. By which she usually means go listen to people. To hear them as whole people, as avenues to different conceptions of being, as people who are broken and sad, or ambitious and eager, but who are first to be heard. Frankly, I almost always hate that advice. Conflict averse, I'd rather doodle with my assumptions and shift my priorities than pause to check in and hear someone's point of view, or brave disagreement, or face a failure to persuade, or have the courage gifted by a chance to learn something. Because it's in the listening that Professor Viramontes stands firm. And I want to suggest then that there are multiple forms of listening in her work, listening that goes largely unnoticed, especially by those of us who see her first and maybe only as a marvelous writer of luminous fiction. It's not just that Helena listens by reading everything, and she reads constantly and reads all the time, everything all over the world. She reads novelists and poets from across the globe. She reads whatever comes across, but she also listens as she reads, talks to other writers, hears what others are enjoying reading, and she picks up texts everywhere she goes and reads the novels, the scholarship produced by other Chicana and Latinx writers, as well as the fiction and poetry that comes her way. One can find evidence of this commitment in an especially overlooked, tucked-away site. As a professor of creative writing, Helena fields requests constantly for letters of recommendation, for tenure, and promotion letters. These letters, in and of themselves, take hours to write, as most of you know. But before the writing comes all the reading, sometimes weeks of reading and giving attention to another's words. My assumption, my guess, is that Professor Viramontes has written dozens and dozens of these letters for famous and obscure writers and scholars across the country. She is too modest to say much, but my best estimate is that at least 200 African American, Asian American, Latina, Chicana, Latinx, indigenous, white working class, and queer writers and scholars can thank her, though they don't know to thank her, for the support she has offered and the thousands of hours of labor such support entails. Sometimes, when I'm a metiche, I get a chance to glimpse some of these letters, and they are, in and of themselves, classes in how to read and how to listen. I just want to, as an aside, say if we could pull those letters together and hide the confidentiality, they are beautiful essays. Thus, she offers careful readings of other writers' hard work. She'll note the achievements in structure and form, language, voice, and theme. She might compare a less well-known writer's work favorably to a very famous writer, anatomizing both writers' work to show often how the less famous person has achieved a more compelling text, created a more riveting account. Of course, it's a smart strategy, a sincere one, that links those who are recognized by establishment gatekeepers and those who are not. But it also helps elevate or platform, as my students say, writers whose work deserves more careful attention by way of showing how to interpret writers, how to listen to them. This kind of attention does not come cheaply. Its price is distraction from much of what she loves, which is doing her own writing, telling stories, getting lost in the dream of fictive, real situations of her making. But she keeps doing it, I believe, out of a commitment to new worlds. Of course, these letters are confidential, and that's a drag, because what they would show, I am so certain, were we able to get our hands on a lot of them, is a literary critic of enormous power, someone who humbly acknowledges limits, but just as brilliantly plunges in to read difficult poetry and to celebrate the poetics, the techniques of making that are so elusive and hard to discern. Professor Viramontes toggles in these literary essays, usually known as promotion letters, between scholarship and poetry. In one, for example, noting how a poet presents Black embodiment and experiences in ways that avoid what scholar Shirali Munshi would call spectacularization. So I just say this because she is reading everything and she can pull from all these different sources to do this kind of listening. Helena has listened to the poets and the critics, to the scholars and the novelists, and does not thereby see simple disciplinary lines between them. She shifts in her readings between the technical markers of a Sestina and the philosophical world-making arguments of Gandhi to the by-the-way insights that Chicanx poets of the 1980s combined, quote, muscular rage with the specificity of community, end quote. What an incredible shorthand analysis, a way to think about a generation of poets whose powerful rage was attached, engaged with a specific set of relations, a sense of commitment to people, to lives in need of nurturing. This aside, in simply somebody's promotion letter, could even be overlooked because Viramontes sails by that insight to offer a thorough discussion of a whole range of contemporary poets, from Terence Hayes to Crystal Williams to Major Jackson. She knows so much, and she reads so much, and she listens so hard. Such listening doesn't, of course, happen just in the world of professional service. Such listening happens in the archives as well and entails immense amounts of research. I've watched in awe as she voraciously reads about a place that has, perhaps, a glancing presence in her current novel, or a historical figure whose shadow casts a very slender line across a text. She'll read book after book, carefully turning the biographies, histories, oral histories, all, as she says, to, quote, trace histories that are too often neglected in both the critical and creative literature. In attempting a different storytelling of history available to readers, I often remark that I attempt to do justice to the topic, in the double sense that philosopher Elizabeth Anderson has imbued this phrase, namely, doing justice in the epistemological sense of being historically detailed, and in the ethical sense of affording a chance to hopefully evaluate the ethics of this history, end quote. In her classroom, she models such careful listening and questioning, the kinds of careful listening and questioning that compels more listening. I wish I had a video to show you of a common Helena move, which maybe she'll do for us this evening, in which she folds her arms, twists slightly, and asks, "And why do you think that is?" It's a question that often helpfully undermines a static assumption, but it also empowers students to think more carefully about the connections and debts that they take for granted. In teaching people that they matter, she models how to respect each other, a step in a commitment to the liberatory understanding that if one person isn't free, no one is. This knowledge of interconnection is illustrated in a beautiful passage in Under the Feet of Jesus. Estrella has reluctantly agreed to help Perfecto Flores with the job, and in doing so, he introduces her to his toolbox. Perfecto Flores taught her the names that went with the tools. A claw hammer, he said with authority, miming its function. Screwdrivers, see, folding up various heads and pointing to them. Crescent wrenches, looped pliers like scissors for cutting chicken or barbed wire. Old wood saw, new hacksaw, a sledgehammer, pry bar, chisel, axe, names that gave meaning to the tools. Tools to build, bury, tear down, rearrange and repair. A box of reasons his hands took pride in. She lifted the pry bar in her hand, felt the coolness of iron and the power of function, weighed the significance it awarded her, and soon she came to understand how essential it was to know these things. That was when she began to read. At first glance, this is a passage about the importance of learning, that knowledge is an avenue to opportunity, to power, and so Estrella begins to understand the importance of applying herself. But there's something more beautiful at stake in the passage as well. This is a prose poem about the complex relationship between words and things, between the feeling of a thing, its weighty impression, and the obscure, abstract dynamic of naming things you feel and touch. But the beauty of the passage also calls our attention to the exquisite possibility that listening can open to new worlds. Estrella really listens, even maybe for the first time. She hears the possibilities, and that action gives her a new sense of possibility. But it is not all romance. Repeatedly, Viramontes' fiction reveals the costs of listening, warns that the labor of listening might be too much. Consider this moment, for example, in Their Dogs Came With Them, when Tranquilina tries to avoid the form of listening that is more commonly called remembering. They worked in a silence that was eerie and non-existent. There were plenty of sounds to go around, the buzz of a meaty fly caught in between the panes of glass in the window, the overspill of broth on the flames, the strikes of a peeler, the woman's breathing. But Tranquilina paid no attention. With every move came a labored breath from the woman, and with every breath came a shorter and raspy wheeze that Tranquilina refused to hear. She felt as if the two of them were landlocked somewhere, surrounded by nothing else outside of the kitchen, except the never-ending solitude of what began in Guero, Texas. Here, listening produces solitude, the isolation violence wreaks as it shifts into the silence of a screaming memory. The narrative moves around the room, the sounds of flies and flames and kitchen work bumping into each other until it narrows toward a memory that we don't want to hear about, to a story that we know too well and don't want to listen to. But Viramontes insists we hear Tranquilina's story, just as the opening pages of Dogs insist we hear Chavela's fury. It's not right, I'm telling you. Chavela raised the flame on the stove and hunched over the spurting fire under the comal. The heat splashed on her face, and then she lowered the gas, inhaled and coughed, and returned her gold bunch package to the pocket of her rhubarb dress. The details and the actions give weight to the cry. It's not right, I'm telling you. And if these two sentences might indeed name the novel's themes, they also speak to the commitment Viramontes' labor as a professor, as a mentor, and as a writer. It's not right signals this commitment to attend to injustice, to refuse to dismiss things as the way of things. It's not right, I'm telling you, names Helena's commitment to tracing histories, quote, that are too often neglected in both the critical and creative literature, in attempting a different storytelling of histories available to readers, end quote. In insisting that it's not right, Helena asks us to be willing to be told, to participate in the work of listening as necessary to the discipline of hope, to the opportunity for change. In these two sentences, Chavela is invoking her coraje as the devastation that the freeway construction is wreaking. It's a devastation she likens to the Mexico City earthquake. The earthquake cracked in mi tierra firme, mi país, now as far away as my youth, a big boom crack. The dogs and gente went crazy from having the earth pulled out right from under them. The earthquake's rubble of wood and clay and water yielded only what was missing: shoes without shoelaces, flowered curtains without windows, a baby rattle without seeds in its hollow belly. We must have been drawn to that for a reason. An arm without a body, and how the white smell of burnt flesh choked. I'm trying to tell you how it feels to have no solid tierra under you. Listen to me. Where could you run? The sound of walls cracking, the ceiling pushed up into a mushroom cloud. Do you need Drano to clean out those ears of yours? It just wasn't right. Nothing was left, I tell you. All of us probably need Drano from time to clear out our ears to hear. And Viramontes acknowledges the blockages, but demands that we too do the labor of listening to them when nothing was left. Even then, we must stay entangled so that we can hear what she tells us. To write is to call attention, but it is also a subtle way to teach us to listen. It's not right, I'm telling you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Pat, and thank you also for that very personal message from Helena, because I know she really wanted to be here, and fortunately it was not possible. But she will be with us virtually at 5 o'clock, and we're going to take a break for about 10 minutes. We'll be back about 4 so that we can continue with the next 2 speakers. Okay? Oh yeah, there is some food and refreshments. Of course, those of you who are watching this on YouTube, sorry. But those of you who are here, please proceed and have some agua fresca and some water and some food. Okay? Thank you. is he? I don't see Dr. Madrid in the room, but I'm sure he's coming. So as we begin the next two panelists before our guest, Helena Maria Viramontes, the honoree for today's symposium, I want to again thank everyone, the Holt Center and the staff here, Trinity University Books, the press is back there with the books. Thank you. And thank you to the technicians, Josh, thank you. And of course, Dr. Madrid for sponsoring us, and Antonia Castañeda, because they're a team. It's my honor and pleasure now to introduce another of my creative writing students, Bella. Props will be up here to introduce our next speaker.
Hi, I just want to apologize in advance. Pollen is horrible and I might sneeze. So Dr. Jodie Marine is an associative professor of English at Texas A&M University, Kingsville, where she also serves as coordinator of freshman and sophomore English. Her areas of specialization are Chicana studies and composition and rhetoric. Dr. Marine's published and forthcoming works focus on Tejanidad, conjunto music, Mexican-American identity, subjectivity, and education in South Texas, and developmental education within Hispanic-serving institutions.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for welcoming me, and thank you to Dr. Norma Cantu for inviting me, and to Dr. Madrid for this entire thing. It's great being here, but it's a little bit anxiety-filled. This is my first conference since COVID. So I'm a little, but it's great being here. Thank you so much. Let me pull up my presentation. Okay. So my presentation is entitled The Dehumanization of Migrant Agricultural Workers, Under the Feet of Jesus 27 Years Later. Under the Feet of Jesus by Helena Maria Viramontes, published in 1995, tells of the many dehumanizations an agricultural migrant family face, the most significant of which includes exposure to deadly chemicals and lack of proper, affordable, and compassionate medical care. In my presentation, I will compare the dehumanizations of the migrant agricultural workers within Under the Feet of Jesus with current migrant agricultural workers' experiences, including their treatment during the COVID-19 global pandemic. First, however, I want to explain my evolutionary connection to Under the Feet of Jesus. I first read Under the Feet of Jesus as a doctoral student in my mid-20s. I was mesmerized with the beautiful metaphors Viramontes uses to paint the images and settings of the novel, to establish context, and to explain the emotional state of characters. However, although I felt compassion for the characters, I didn't connect their present with my past. Then in my early 30s, I read Under the Feet of Jesus again. I wanted to see how I could teach the novel to my Chicana literature course. I made connections to the Chicano movement and to Tomás Rivera's No se lo tragó la tierra. And I started to question my parents more about their migrant life. I started to make connections that were a bit more personal. However, reading Under the Feet of Jesus now, and I'm not telling you my age, hits me differently because I'm a caregiver. I'm a mother, a wife, and I do for my mother more than I ever have. I now better understand the incredible pressure Petra, Perfecto, and Estrella must have felt to financially sustain their family and what that pressure does to the body and mind.
As a result, I am now seeing the struggles of these characters in a real-world context, and it's made me reflect on what my family went through as migrant workers. Therefore, I want to continue my presentation a bit differently. I want to introduce you to my maternal grandmother, Maria Vela. In this picture, she must be in her late 20s, early 30s. My mother always had this picture up of her in our home when I was growing up. I always thought it was a picture of my grandmother at the beach. It made sense to me because my grandmother lived in Alice, which is close to Corpus Christi. I thought the background was the beach. It's not. It's rows of cotton. In between Alice and Corpus Christi are fields of cotton. From the stories my mother tells me, my grandmother was a migrant worker traveling to Michigan and Illinois, then back to Texas, following the crops, until she was hired as a maid and nanny to a wealthy family in Alice in her 30s. My grandmother would pick crops alongside her mother and her 3 young daughters, while her toddler would lay in a sack full of cotton as she dragged him along through the rows with her. Unfortunately, I don't know the context of this photo. Perhaps it was the beginning of her day in the fields, or maybe she was posing with the cotton as a remembrance, a memory, like my Aunt Virgie in this next picture. Virgie, Maria's eldest daughter, spent most of her childhood picking crops. Years later, on a road trip with her daughters, they passed by a full cotton field. Virgie asked them to stop because she wanted to take a picture with the cotton. Although picking cotton had been excruciatingly labor-intensive and physically painful from the thorns, the cotton fields were a part of her life. It was her history, where she worked alongside her grandmother, mother, and sisters, and where she met her future husband at the age of 11. The symbolism of the cotton field also represented her triumphs, how she was no longer a migrant worker, but a business owner. I show you these 2 photos to recognize the many hardships they and the rest of my family endured as migrant agricultural workers. As Viramontes states, quote, "I want to do justice to their voices, to tell these women in my own gentle way that I will fight for them, that they will provide me with my own source of humanity," end quote. I also find strength and humanity in my paternal grandparents, who were also migrant workers. I want to recognize and fight for my father, who was sent alone on a bus up north to pick crops at the young age of 7. I want to recognize my husband's parents, who met in the fields of San Antonio and got out of migrant work after their first child, my husband, was born to stop the cycle of poverty. My husband's father enlisted in the Marines during the Vietnam War so that his young wife and son would benefit from his military pay and benefits. I want to recognize all of my family's hardships and sacrifices. Learning about them has altered my connection with Under the Feet of Jesus. I am now better able to understand the realities of these many hardships and sacrifices because I have seen the real-world effects they have had on my family. Under the Feet of Jesus tells the story of 13-year-old Estrella, her love interest Alejo, who is 15, Estrella's 4 younger siblings, their pregnant mother Petra, who is in her 30s, and Petra's common-law husband Perfecto Flores, who is 73 years old. The novel captures the summer season of the family picking grapes in California. Viramontes masterfully describes the hopelessness, indignities, and the many dehumanizations migrant workers endure by showing what Estrella and her family go through. The full body muscle aches from the constant bending and lifting in the burning sun all day. The hot, cramped, and unfurnished living conditions of the work camp. The teachers that think them dirty and unworthy of an education. The fear of being deported because they are migrant workers, even though they are U.S. citizens. The pesticide-laced water they are forced to drink in the work camp that is believed to cause illness and birth defects. The below-poverty wages that leads to home and food insecurity, even when all they are offered at the work camp grocery store is bruised and almost rotten fruit and vegetables. Being drenched in pesticide while picking crops. The daño in the fields. that results in severe illness, and the patronizing for-profit healthcare facility that almost never has a doctor. Estrella and her family suffer such harshness that they are forced to fight for their rights. For example, in an early exchange between Petra and Estrella regarding what to do if the Border Patrol approaches, Petra tells Estrella, quote, "Don't run scared. You stay there and look them in the eye. Don't let them make you feel like you did a crime for picking vegetables they'll be eating for dinner. If they stop you, if they try to pull you into the green vans, you tell them the birth certificates are under the feet of Jesus. Tell them que tienes una madre aquí," end quote. Petra defies the discrimination she and her family face. She refuses to be delegitimized. It is the same demand of dignity and justice that leads Estrella to the climax of the novel, where she demands the nurse give them their $9.07 back that she charged them, which was all of their money, just to tell them to take Alejo to the hospital. They need that $9.07 back to put gas in their barely alive station wagon to take Alejo to the hospital 20 miles away, so that his life could possibly be saved, because he was worth saving. In that moment, Estrella thinks, quote, God was mean and did not care, and she was alone to fend for herself. Then she starts to think the oil was from their bones, and it was their bones that kept the nurse's car from not halting on some highway, kept her on her way to Daisy Field to pick up her boys at 6. It was their bones that kept them moving on the long dotted line on the map, their bones. Why couldn't the nurse see that? Estrella had figured it out. The nurse owed them as much as they owed her, end quote. So she gets the crowbar from the station wagon and demands their money back so that they can try to save Alejo. This scene is powerful because it depicts a family fighting for their survival. It's powerful because Estrella is demanding justice for Alejo. She's demanding justice for them all. Unfortunately, the indignities and harmful working conditions suffered by Estrella and Alejo are still going on today. And I just realized I didn't change the slide. Sorry about that. Today, it's time to change the slide. There are over 3 million agricultural farm workers in the U.S. 31% are U.S. citizens, 21% are documented immigrants, and 48% are undocumented immigrants. The large majority are seasonal, meaning they do not move from their primary residence and pick crops in the area when they are in season. 19% of agricultural farm workers are migratory, meaning they move often to follow the crops. Up to 800,000 of all agricultural farm workers are minors. According to the Fair Labor Standards Act, children as young as 12 can work in agriculture with parental consent, 7 days a week for an unspecified amount of time outside of school hours. However, each state has their own employment laws. In Texas, children 11 and younger can work in agriculture with parental consent 7 days a week for an unspecified amount of time after school hours. There is no official data regarding how many agricultural farm workers are under the age of 12. Additionally, many farm workers are paid by how many buckets or sacks they fill, which is referred to as piece rate. Piece rates depend on the state and the crop picked. For example, in Georgia, farmers pay workers 45 cents per 35-pound buckets of sweet potatoes. After picking 120 buckets of sweet potatoes in 8 hours, which is 4,375 pounds of sweet potatoes, a farm worker would earn in piece rate $54, which would be less than the minimum wage per hour, $58. As a result of this unfair wage practice, the Fair Labor Standards Act was amended to state that a farmer must pay a piece rate employee at the federal or state minimum wage, depending on the state's laws, for the hours they worked if the employee's piece rate pay is calculated to be less than that what than what they would have earned working at minimum wage. Miners would get $4.25 an hour. However, smaller farms, or those farms who work under a certain amount of days per year, are exempt from the minimum wage stipulation and are exempt from paying overtime, keeping those farmers' wages, including miners, at piece rate. I want to show you what this looks like. I'm going to share with you trailers to 2 documentaries about seasonal and migratory farm workers in the US. The first documentary is called The Harvest, La Cosecha, and was released in 2010. It follows 3 migrant children, Zulema Lopez, who is a 12-year-old US citizen from El Cenizo, Texas, 14-year-old Perla Sanchez, a US citizen from Weslaco, Texas, and Victor Huapilla, a 16-year-old documented immigrant from Mexico.
I don't really know when I started picking crops because ever since I was born.
Do we know how to higher the volume? Oh, it stayed.
I remember picking crops.
On a slow day, I carry 1,500 pounds of tomatoes.
They don't know what they eat, what they have in the table. It's picked up from my migrant. They don't understand that. I bet you they don't even know.
A child 10 years old can't work at McDonald's. A child cannot work in hazardous occupations. But in agriculture, they can work you 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. They have no protections. And that is legal in America today.
Some days I just get tired and tell my mom I'm not doing this anymore.
I had all these red spots all over my body. I didn't know, I thought it was poison ivy.
La piel se me empezó a caer. Sentí que había mucho químico cuando estaba piscando.
I have a dream to become a lawyer. I have so many dreams to help other people, just like me.
Mi inspiración todo tiempo va a ser mi familia porque no los quiero ver sufrir.
How do I help my family? How do I show support if I know there's no money, I know there's no jobs here? I just want to go back to my house.
I wish I would have a different life for my kids. I don't think any mother would like to see their kids working.
I make like $64 a week. I think I'm helping her with that.
Zulema and Perla are much like Estrella. They feel helpless in the harshness and uncertainty of migrant work. Reflecting on her family's circumstance and how it affected her brother's death, Perla says, Perla is the one who spoke about the dreams that she had. Perla says, quote, "My brother Frankie, he was shot. He died in a lobby room. My brother went walking into the hospital and came out dead. Why? Because they didn't help him. Why? Because we didn't have any money. Why don't we have any money? Because we can't finish school. Why can't we finish school? It's just a cycle. You can't finish school because you're a migrant. You leave early, you don't have the grades. Moving to all those schools, sometimes your grades don't even get there and they have to start from zero. They won't even pass you if your grades don't get there. I got held back 1 year. I'm supposed to be in 9th grade, but I'm in 8th. Time doesn't stop because you're doing this. Time doesn't stop because you're a migrant. Time goes, and as it goes faster. Grades keep going, and if you fail, you fail. If you pass, you pass. End quote. The cycle of feeling helpless Perla describes here is similar to Estrella's reflection on her own instability. Quote, "It was always a question of work, and work depended on the harvest, the car running, their health, and the conditions on the road, how long the money held out, and the weather, which meant they could depend on nothing." End quote. The second documentary, Fruits of Labor, released in 2021, so it was just released, follows Ashley Solis Pavon, a 16-year-old US citizen who works days picking strawberries in the California fields and nights packing frozen strawberries, all while trying to graduate high school and preparing for her mother's potential deportation. The obligation Ashley feels towards her family and her tiredness reminds me of Estrella.
As a little kid, my mom often said, "Once you get the tortilla to puff up on the stove, you'll be ready to marry." My mom got a divorce. My mom said to me, "Nosotros tenemos los pantalones de la casa." Ella trabaja 7 días a la semana. Soy la única que puede cuidar a mis hermanos si algo llegara a pasarle a mi madre. Empecé a trabajar a los 15 años en la costa central de California, en donde nací.
If you work hard, you can get to your dreams. Dream big and work hard.
Le digo, yo no tengo papeles, pero tú, si tú sacas tu preparatoria, vas a poder agarrar un trabajo mejor que yo para que no fuera una muchacha más de las que ya hay frustrada.
¿Cómo desearía solo preocuparme de las cosas que se preocupan las chicas de mi edad?
Presidente Trump amenaza con deportar a millones de indocumentados.
Immigration and Custom Enforcement agents conducting raids on the Central Coast this week.
¿Ya venían para acá arriba?
Pues según que tocaron acá arriba. No sé cómo será mi futuro.
If you notice, the documentaries were produced before the COVID-19 global pandemic. Deemed, quote, critical to the food supply chain, end quote, farm workers were identified as essential workers by the federal government and given letters by the Department of Homeland Security that gave them permission to work outside of the home. However, the pandemic made things worse because it was very hard for farm workers, especially migrants, to socially distance in the cramped housing within the work camps and the crowded trucks and buses to transport them to the fields and keep their hands sanitized, making them more susceptible to getting and transmitting the virus. Furthermore, if a farm worker did get sick, they, in most cases, did not have the benefit of paid sick leave to take care of themselves or a family member, nor could they afford the proper medical treatment required to treat COVID-19, nor collect unemployment if they lost their jobs. According to the National Center for Farm Worker Health, over 1 million farm workers were infected with COVID-19, and at least 7,240 farm workers died of the virus, and that's a very low estimate. I inform you of these facts so that you know of the grave injustices that these essential workers paid for our food these essential workers paid for our food with their lives. Similarly, I showed you these documentaries so that you know they exist, so that you see Zulema, Perla, Ashley, and the others, and you know their stories. I want you to see them so that you know they exist. Now, I want you to do something about the dehumanizations and injustices suffered by them and other farm workers. I ask that you support the CARES Act, which stands for Children's Act for Responsible Employment. The CARES Act, which was first proposed to Congress in 2009 by Congresswoman Lucille Roval Allard, prohibits children 13 years and younger from working in agriculture. It limits agricultural work hours for 14 and 15-year-olds. It raises the age requirements for working in hazardous conditions to 18 years of age. And it increases agriculture employer fines for violating work conditions and pay. I also ask that you support the following organizations: the Center for Farm Worker Families, Farm Worker Justice, and Justice for Migrant Women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jodie. I'll call on Alexis Acevedo, another one of our students, to introduce our last speaker.
Gabriela Gutierrez is a poet and professor in modern languages and women, gender, and sexuality studies at the University of Seattle. She's first editor of Presumed Incompetent, The Intersections of Race and Class for Women in Academia, as well as single editor of various other books in Chicana criticism. She is also a main contributor in multi-genre Latinx women's anthology, Indomitable, Indomables. In addition, she is also co-editor of the second volume of Presumed Incompetent, Race, Class, Power, and Resistance of Women in Academia, which is known for having actively and past changed the climate in academia for people of color. She recently co-edited a poetry anthology of Latinx Chican poets that includes 66 poets and her last bilingual poetry collection, How Many Indians Can We Be? ¿Cuántos indios podemos ser?
With the time. So, okay.
So I have two parts to my presentation. And the first part is with them, with us, with Helena. The moths, the dogs, Jesus, Jesús, and Miss Clairol. Gracias, Norma, por este honor. Como te dije, tienes amigos en las nubes, la tierra, las urbes, los pueblos, los barcos, los cielos. Eres de esas personas inolvidables que marcan los surcos de la vida de todos nosotros, con flores, en macetas de papel, de piel, de comida, todos hechos biblioteca. The tortilla book I have encuadernado has been made with the loose pages you have contributed to honoring, respecting, publishing others. Dr. Arturo Madrid has appeared in my life at the most unexpected times. When I received a scholarship as a 17-year-old for migrant students, and we attended a conference for my organization, he was the keynote speaker. The first man of color I saw behind the podium in the United States. a second time in LA when my folklorico group danced for a conference he was again keynoting at while I was a college student at Occidental. Years later, I saw him present his work at a literary conference here in San Antonio when I was a newly minted PhD, and many times throughout my career. And now, as my mother would say, la vida es un disco, and people you admire and love like a song keep reappearing in your life. I am ever so honored to be here. Thanks to Norma and Helena Maria, to honor you, to honor them. And I really want to thank Corinne for all the help that she gives. And of course, Elvia and Elsa, they're always there. So this is an institution. When you find people with your experiences, thoughts, philosophies, bodies, reflections, misadventures, calloused hands in literature, women that, like your mother, pray the rosary while making tortillas, who have scars on their bellies that look like train tracks, you know you are not dreaming, that Shakespeare and Calderón de la Barca were wrong. No, la vida no es un sueño. Many years ago, the version of Miss Clairol that appeared in the Los Angeles Times woke me up to the fact that women from fiction like Ofelia Tranquilina, queer people like Turtle, children like Cookie were not the fiction of our realities, but in fact the realities in our world of exceptions. Because Ofelia from Miss Clairol had love for the world, working as a seamstress and being a single mother in Los Angeles, it gave her time to dream, dance, and even smoke. You lifted her from the list of victims we were made to become in the hands of mainstream America. Instead, Chicanx women became unfettered beings in your hands. And so did Chicanx academics. In Eve's Tuck words, I would say that you have been suspending damage of our people ever since your first story appeared in print in the 70s. Little by little, making this lake of damage into a charco, something we could jump over. But what I fully understood about the invaluable imprint of Helena Maria Viramontes' literature in our American culture was when my students, mostly upper class and white in a Chicanx literature class, had a debate about whether giving Campbell's soup to your children was being a good mother or not. It was then that I knew that the Bible had an insert that was bigger than the original text. Helena Maria's work was making my students shake with ambivalence about their very small worlds. Turtle and Tranquilina, two of the four main characters of Their Dogs Came With Them, were not Ruth or Sarah from the Bible. They were more complex. They survived in a land that should have sustained their goodness, their kindness, their wholesomeness, but instead battered and raped one of them. And yet they still made soup for the poor. They were the archetypical eggs in an industrial egg beater bowl, attempting to remain unscathed in what was the improbability of a 20th and 21st century, specially designed by the American determinism assigned to people of color. No, you were not H.G. Wells, succinctly leaving people aghast with his descriptions of the English countryside folk in his negation of a god in the early 1900s, who described his family heroically disgusting. But you were equally describing our people with adjectives never used on us previously, with language not allocated to our homes and families. the fragility of the digitized version of the Chicanx soul, imagined as a commodity for those who wish to gaze upon us from one-dimensional perspectives, deconstructed, undone, pulverized by your description of a non-dream, but instead a hard-working peoples who joyously and valiantly resisted, and not only survived but thrived, soared in conditions that should have been inhuman. Helena Maria Viramontes, thank you for allowing the children of migrant farm workers like myself to read about their mothers as courageous and indomitable. Maybe some of them, Petra, from Under the Feet of Jesus, perhaps mentally ill, but also able to recover from the pandemic of invisibility. A naturalism of Chicanx populations is what you evolved, and yet Émile Zola, the naturalist, André Breton, the surrealist, or even Paul Éluard and Guillaume Apollinaire, the poets I most admired as a young woman, would have become unpetrified with your literary voice. Your magical literary abracadabra would have unearthed their vision towards the rest of the world. You challenge each of them, the French naturalists, the poets, the Latin American modernists, because with your pincel, paintbrush, pardon me, your pen, you have left them wondering why they did not look at us for direction, inspiration, poetry. And yet, Chicanx creativists have invalidated prison walls to direct plays based on Their Dogs Came With Them inside women's high-security prisons in Arizona with your stories, like Vicky Gris has, with your novel that magically turned nature into her backdrop on that day 2 years ago when we all witnessed the precedent of women prisoners turned actresses who shone thanks to you. By us, I mean the Americans, the Mexicans, the Mexican Americans, the Chicanx people, the women who make word pozole in mole-inspired colors of nature and hard work, on their backs, entire Latinx populations to represent. They would have learned to carry water on their heads, children on their backs, and entire populations on their arms to resemble our strength while navigating a chalupa along the murky waters of structural and silent biases, producing milk for the baby at their breasts made out of history, and writing a novel in their heads as Helena Maria has done against many odds and among many flowers, all beautiful and some less poisonous than others. Some exotic regenerative species, not poisonous at all. While riding into existence, a mama bear with flowers, smiling across the continent and beyond, letting people know we are beyond what Eve Talk would call suspending damage. That she and Norma Cantu have been theorizing contributions and adding colors to the palette of our representation through their writings, adding pixels to our gaze of our own selves and gigabytes to our intersectional computers, as well as putting breast milk on the table of beauty. Caribou Cafe, her story in The Moths and Other Stories. It is the short story of a woman who will defend her children from the state, the police, the war, and an entire army and country. Helena Maria has traveled through academia in her chalupa adorned Chicanx. Critics have best filtered the essence of your writing, Helena Maria, by stating the following in Rebozos de Palabras, and Helena Maria Viramontes' critical reader I edited. A collection I edited, an award-winning collection published in 2013. if we understand, these two quotes are by Juan Maybush. I could not quote them all, but if you're interested in Viramontes, I urge you to purchase the book. I only have 3 here, but it's a wonderful book. And I'm going to mention a few of you. This first quote, Juan Maybush. If we understand ethics and practices of freedom and self-care, we can read how Viramontes' characters in such a way that gives rise to liberation, end quote. Helena Maria Viramontes depicts an alternative notion of love, one that is associated with struggle and survival as well as with learning and transformation. Viramontes' stories demonstrate something else entirely, a form of love in which epistemological value coincides with ethical value, thereby rejoining love and liberation, end quote. Our very own Sonia Saldívar Hall, she's right here. Writes a magnificent foreword for Rebozos de Palabras in Helena Maria Viramontes' critical reader. Quote, the new direction I detected was a defining Chicana feminist, literary theorists, and philosophers. Excuse me, I skipped it all. Chicana feminist literary production that elaborated the theoretical tracts being developed by feminist literary production. The collection of short stories articulated the previously silenced voices of girls, young women, and mature women, las mujeres whose unrecognized labor, quiet life work, and often not so quiet political positions as working class women in the flesh exploded into the consciousness of those of us who were reading against the grain in academic settings, where these new literary productions often were not welcome or considered legitimate literature. End quote. Sonia Saldívar Hall opens the next paragraph of her intro with a quote from Helena Maria. Look at these lives. I just want you to look at this life. Sonia closes her eloquent piece with these sentences, most pertinent today. At this historical moment, when the United States once again attempts to enact virulently anti-Mexican and Latino legislation, reading Helena Maria Viramontes' literary interventions is urgent. But I'm sad, Sonia, because this is still true. And this is 8 years ago that Rebozos de Palabra came out. Although I had already read The Moths and Other Stories, a collection I recently translated for bilingual edition published by Bilingual Review, and way before Under the Feet of Jesus, the amazing novel that has not yet been studied as it should be. When I met you, Helena Maria, I knew I was before someone who was about to change the perception of many about our literature and our people. I have to thank someone who is truly responsible for most of what I have published about you, and that is one of the top 3 critics, in my opinion, of Chicana critics. Although I live a horizontal existence, I don't usually. I do have to thank Yvonne Yarbrough Bejarano, my mentor and one who taught me how to gaze upon you, Helena, our writer, with a critical, non-vertical, intersectional gaze, and how to delve into an evolving analysis of your ever-flowing and overflowing writing persona, and the person who gave us a gaze into your work with her introduction to your collection, The Moths and Other Stories. That was Yvonne. And I have a few quotes to begin my paper. That was just a pre-paper, right? That was the personal part that I wanted to thank all of you. I think we're going to have to publish it so that you can read the whole thing, because I realize, and I've been told, I actually only have like 4 minutes. Yeah, because I started at, I have 5 minutes. So I'm going to read part of this paper. I'm going to skip a lot of parts so it might feel disjointed. But before I do that, I want to read the poem because I don't want to skip the poem. I wrote a poem for this. I am a poet. Miracles. They call the metal body parts you hang on saints' gowns miracles. They thank saints for the miracles that saved their loved ones from a heart attack, un corazón, the loss of vision, un ojo, the baby who lived, a small open-armed pin, to be put as a miracle, a leg milagro, for the trucker who might have lost his leg but didn't, a hand, una mano, for him whose hand was caught in a machine. But there is no image for you gathering back your soul. What would signify soul? The true miracle they don't know, that we can still smile, that we weren't killed and our children grew up in our families, not in a foster home. The invisibilized see miracles in every car they drive, every meal together, every day a bed, every night warm, every friend loyalty, every book knowledge, every vegetable, every child, every bicycle, every unimprisoned thought. The miracle is that we have turned out to be our grandmother's blessings. There should be book milagros with your name. Helena Maria, Norma, Arturo, Antonia, Sonia, Mary Pat. And I'll read a couple of parts from my paper. I wanted to I'm going to skip some things. I'm going to skip the Lorna Di Cervantes and the León Portilla poems. Yeah, but I started 2 more minutes. Oh gosh, so much pressure. I'll just read the end of my paper. My paper is 23 pages long. So. The men and women we see are the underdogs of a society that rarely notices them. Quote, Amma looked so tired. The soft, fleshy lips that once appeared in her wedding photograph were now chafed slits where she inhaled her cigarettes. The whites of her eyes were pinkish, as if the pain flooded even the smallest veins. End quote. They have the ability to become the puppets of society. These characters, several children, spill over their tight clothes and shoes as they grow, their growth a liability since they are imprisoned by them, as is the case of Turtle. Once again, in Viramontes' kneading pen, and through her characters, women become unfettered hands, the heroines who produce and revive babies against the hostile nature betrothed to them by society. I have a quote about that. The evolution of the Chicano body through Viramontes' oeuvre is exemplary. In Their Dogs Came With Them, she expands the variability of representation in Chicano literature. The reader becomes acquainted with the urban Chicano Latino characters, still through a social class lens, nonetheless encompassing previously unexposed, non-delineated subjectivities, such as the biracial Protestant, androgynous, and Vietnam bodies. These unveiled bodies of the Chicanx community are all depicted and presented to us in a portrait of society that Viramontes makes visible. Her characters are reformulated for the reader to decipher. Through them, as well as personified fluctuations of 60s and 70s East Los Angeles urban landscape, Helena Maria Viramontes responds to the society from which she hailed. The experiences of struggle are fleshed out through characters both strong and weak, comprising a dynamic narrative of social and physical experience. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Gabriela. It's been a pleasure. And I know I have Helena Maria waiting. So let us start. Josh, is it working? I'm over here waiting to be let in, but this...
You're in, but there's only one participant here. So...
And I'm waiting to be let in. I try to log in and it says I'm waiting to be let in.
You're in the Zoom call. There's nobody else in here though.
I know. How can I get in? I'm trying to get in.
On there.
We have a student that's going to be introducing Dr. Viramontes.
Here we go. Perfect.
Okay. It's my honor today to present Professor and writer Helena Maria Viramontes.
Sorry, I didn't tell you. This is Julissa Vasquez. This is one of our creative writing students.
She was born in East LA, and she is now a distinguished professor of arts and sciences in English at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. She's author of the Professor and writer Helena Maria Viramontes.
The audio.
Okay.
Does that work?
Okay.
Okay.
She was born in East LA, and she is now a distinguished professor of arts and sciences in English at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. She's author of the Professor and writer Helena Maria Viramontes. She's author of The Moths and Other Stories, Under the Feet of Jesus, and Their Dogs Came With Them. In 2007, she was named a Ford Fellow in Literature by United States Artists. She has received many awards and recognitions, some of which include the John Dos Passos Prize for Literature, a Sundance Institute Fellowship, an NEA Fellowship, a Spirit Award from the California Latino Legislative Caucus, and a 27 Bellagio Center residency from the Rockefeller Foundation. In 2015, the Helena Maria Viramontes Lecture was inaugurated at California State University, Long Beach. In addition to teaching, she is now working on her current novel. Kindly help me welcome her with an applause.
You can go ahead and start speaking. You can go ahead and start speaking.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, let me tell you, I really want to thank all of the organizers, all the wonderful, wonderful speakers. I'm just so full of emotion and incredible information. And more than anything else, I think love. Oh, I could just feel each of the presenters just really emoting. Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, let me tell you, I really want to thank all of the organizers, all the wonderful, wonderful speakers. I'm just so full of emotion and incredible information. And more than anything else, I think love. Oh, I could just feel each of the presenters just really emoting. Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, let me tell you, I really want to thank all of the organizers, all the wonderful, wonderful speakers. I'm just so full of emotion and incredible information. And more than anything, yes, I do. Okay. Does that help? Okay, let me see. Okay. Okay, let me, okay, here we go. Should we start again? Okay, so I'm assuming it's I know there was some technical difficulties, including my own stuttering. So all of this to say is I wanted to really just thank Norma and Sonia. I feel as if I'm there, I feel as if I'm there. And then in many ways, when I'm listening to these wonderful speakers, I feel a certain, I have to distance myself because if not, I'll just start crying. But anyway, I want to thank you very, very much for this incredible honor to be a part of the Arturo Madrid Lecture, and perhaps sometime in the future, I can visit San Antonio again and just give hugs to everybody. I would like to begin with a certain amount of comments, and then from there, do a little bit of reading, if that's okay with you all. With my new, I would like to read parts of my new novel, The Cemetery Boys. Okay, so here it begins. The Heretic and the Interloper. 1. In his lovely memoir of family, In the Country of Empty Crosses, the story of a Hispano-Protestant family in Catholic New Mexico, Arturo Madrid begins with visiting a Camposanto, a cemetery, to seek genealogical information about his forebears. Capturing the ironies of religious differences and the contradictions of contested geographic space, from the indigenous displacement to Spanish colonization and right up to the military takeover of New Mexico by Stephen Kearny in 1986, Madrid writes, quote, "My parents were not natives of Upper Rio Chama Valley. Their religious beliefs and cultural practices were different from those of the locals. They were Hispano Protestants in a Hispano Catholic community, and the only ones at that. By virtue of their profession, he an educator, she a public official, my parents had a standing in my community. They may have been heretics, even interlopers, but they were treated with courtesy and respect. I was aware of that differing social status, but I had no particular sense of where it originated or what consisted of, nor what price my parents and their parents had paid to acquire it," unquote. I suspect that there is more than curiosity that drives many Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx, and Latino, Latina, and Latinx to seek out the answer to the question Madrid poses: where are you from? As if we have an inherent need, a hard wiring of sorts, to connect our lives to a larger schema of meaning, especially for people whose communal histories have been devalued or erased completely. And so, for the record, Madrid became a keeper of memories as he began to examine his family tree, just as Lorna de Cervantes became her family's scribe, quote, translator of foreign mail, interpreting letters for the government, notices, unquote. 2. For those who were illiterate, like my paternal grandmother, Mama Cuca, a keeper proved necessary for her to recite her recipes orally in order to pass them down. Or for those who were self-taught, like my paternal grandfather, Papa Feliz, who must have felt it important to record full names and dates of births, deaths, down to the day of the week, in chronological order of his siblings and his children. It says something about what my paternal grandparents found significant, an affirmation of their existence at a time when they felt both invisible and hungry for nourishment. 3. Many of us have felt like heretics and interlopers throughout our lives. In whatever fields we discover, whatever activism we are participants in, whatever loves and passions we were destined to pursue, whatever non-binary beings we identify as, what is the price we've had to pay? 4. To be a heretic, to be an interloper, is defined by a departure of accepted norms of belief or by an unlawful intruder. And it is not the definition. Now, is it that not the definition of any writer or artist? Are not BIPOC writers more so? In a revision of this assertion, the colonizers were the unlawful intruders, while indigenous peoples that dominate narratives. I'm sorry, this has been, okay, let me repeat that. In this revision of assertion, the colonizers were the unlawful intruders, while indigenous peoples, the dominant narrative. History is complicated, and so the view of it is determined from where you stand. 5. I became a heretic writer. Just as I learned to read chaotically, I approach writing in a chaotic way. Over the years, I have taught myself to be careful in the role as an interloper of cultural communities and sexual orientation, of past histories and genderized characters. I am often lost, regretting my territorial transgressions. What was I thinking, I ask myself in a trance of insecurities. I keep an abundance of pages as I write to myself. I have sometimes failed as a keeper. I have failed as a scribe. My translator cells don't compute. I feel like an imposter, a poser, an interloper in the American literary landscape, a heretic without teeth. I go out for a walk and pray among the pines. 6. Then I try it all over again. 7. For several years now, I have been at work on The Cemetery Boys, an American triptych, a historical novel that, like the freeways of Los Angeles and their dogs came with them, is at the crossroads of colonial history, politics, and aesthetics. Boys is a multi-temporal and multi-generational novel that spans 3 wars: the Second World War, the Vietnam War, and the Iraq War, and centers on the lives of particular families. I take on California history not only rooted in national and cultural intersections, but also in transnational migrations. Consequently, the novel moves from Punjab to Haiti, from Germany to the Philippines, to characters laboring in the fields of California or working in the streets of Los Angeles that make up ethnic Los Angeles. Because of this, in writing The Cemetery Boys, I have committed full-fledged heresy of conventional novelistic modes. A narrative art structure would be of no use in telling these stories. I came to discover that Boys is structured as an upside-down pyramid. Communities in book 1, narrowing to a group of boys belonging to a club in book 2, and finally, a relationship between a father and son that concludes the triptych. 8. In using a strategy I describe as palimpsestic storytelling, I try to recreate a textured, nuanced, and sensual treatment that is both personal yet simultaneously revealing of a buried larger history. Without this leveling, without these layers, without paying close attention, I would not have the bravery to see a novel surfacing as a pyramid. 9. This technique of palimpsestic storytelling helps me to focus on differing ethnic and racial populations that coexisted in often interdependent ways, making contact and influencing each other in the 1920s and 30s in Los Angeles and Southern California more generally, without, I hope, losing cultural intimacy or reducing communities to caricatures. I begin with the multi-ethnic migrations that took place at the turn of the century and follows these migrants into the Great Depression in order to set the scene for the multi-ethnic Los Angeles of the 30s and 40s, which historians and oral testimonies alike offer stories of its vibrant intersections. The majority were working class, red-line communities that were relegated to this particular area as South Central, Little Tokyo, Chinatown, Boyle Heights, and East LA. 10. Stories slowly surface as I research, mostly in my chaotic way, always trying to find what Flaubert called the divine detail, that object or sentiment that takes hold of my imagination. I recognize the detail as a moment of grace, a larger sign from this web, an ecology of past and present lives that calls to be examined more closely to find the hidden truth. 11. Acknowledgement of indigenous genocide comes first and foremost. Then the acknowledgement that indigenous lives still living continue to struggle against this violence. Secondly, there would be no BIPOC framing of Los Angeles as a contact city, no view of solidarity on the city streets or on the fields of California without the transnational migration histories that reflect enforced slavery or war annexation, or those migrations from countries sized by US imperialism. 12. At this point in my career, I'm driven to challenge the individual silos of American literary studies, more so of readers who stage their bookshelves in one directed interest. My inspiration and perspiration is to create mutual shared BIPOC spaces, culture, cross-pollinizations of historical experience with a sense of solidarity. And thus, like a writer I hope to become, I am an interloper of racial, cultural, and racial and cultural communities that are not my own. 13. Talk about treading dangerous ground. 14. I approach each cultural history by seeing it as a home with open windows. I research history of the construction, study the territory like a soil surveyor, pick up the scent of meals being cooked, listen to the music, visit the gardens, but I am very respectful because I know I am an interloper. Only when I have made myself humble by these nuances, only when I feel skilled and quiet enough to see, will I stand at the threshold and ready myself to ask for permission. 15. What was I thinking? I keep asking myself in a trance of insecurities. 16. Without the love of people, without the love of stories, without a mode of resistance like grace, is it possible to live as a heretic? To withstand living in isolation, some sense of alienation? In our sexist and patriarchal world, we see early on such punishment in detention centers and correctional facilities, and especially in juvenile detention centers for underage girls. Young girls are the most vulnerable populations, as vulnerable as the undocumented. Who of us can lift their voices? Who will guide them to find their own voices? When they do, what price do they have to pay? 17. Once in a Texas city, I sat around a table talking with a group of young girls at a detention center. I covered my storylines while reading from my first publication, The Moths and Other Stories. After I had finished, I asked if there were any questions, and immediately a hand shot up. "Is that you on the cover?" a young blondish girl asked, pointing to the John Valadez painting of the butterfly. An East LA Chicana with a butterfly tattoo on her chest. It's the front cover of The Moths. "No," I said, "but how cool is her makeup?" And that was all they needed. They asked me about my jewelry, then asked me about my curls, and then slowly began touching me. First my fingers to admire my rings, then my hair to unspool my curls. They touched my chin to examine the residue of my lipstick, touched my earrings, my blouse. At first this startled me, and it was something a little discomforting and I was a little discomforted at the curious questions about their intimate strokes. I came to think that in these strange exchanges, what these very young girls, missed and sought most was touch, a communal act against feeling alienated and ashamed, a hunger for intimacy disallowed, it seemed, at the juvie center. 18. Heretics and interlopers are forever vulnerable, like these underage girls. I see how they have challenged rules in our silence. Their scorched minds and bodies pay a price for such practices. Way too often, historical accounts of heretics and interlopers have terrible endings. Yet in fiction, we can dig up those moments of grace, Those standalone glows around the heart illuminate powerful understanding that we are all one. 19. I also remember a juvenile detention center in central New York where I talked with a classroom of young girls, most of them brown and black. Beforehand, I was given a list of restricted personal topics that were forbidden for me to discuss in class. And I jokingly said to the guard, "You've never been in a creative writing class, have you?" For isn't it in the creative writing classes that we challenge writers to seek out and examine the personal? Only in creative writing class can students learn to be heretics of the mind, interlopers of their own experiences. In any event, as I conducted the class, one of the girls asked for a pardon to leave as her family was coming to visit from New York City because it was her birthday. I said, of course, and went back to teaching a writing prompt. Soon afterwards, the students were dismissed, and on my way out the door, I recognized the birthday girl sitting in the waiting room and immediately thought that her family did not arrive as she looked very downcast. I went over to talk with her, and as I got closer, I saw a bundle on her lap, a stuffed teddy bear, and a pink box next to her. "Hey there," I said, trying to act jovial. "What you got there?" She smiled and said it was a gift from her mother and brother. The box, a small sheet cake with a few absent slices. Her family had only been able to stay an hour or so because they had to catch a bus back to the city since the mother had to work the next day. 20. I never forgot these experiences because they speak of human utterances, those murmurs of life that we somehow do not hear or worse yet, acknowledge. So much can be said about the reaffirmation of the living, breathing experience, liberating an incarcerated body by returning their imaginative forces, nurturing their value, making them visible. 21. Allow me to return to the story of the birthday girl who sat crestfallen with a teddy bear on her lap. I told her how wonderful her family was for coming, taking a 10-hour round-trip bus ride to share a cake with her. "How loved," I said, "you are." And I meant every word. Thank you. Now I would like to read portions of The Cemetery Boys to give you an understanding why this novel is making me crazy, but at the same time, I think I'm doing something that is original. I would say. I'm trying to find my let's see. Okay. Okay. I'm going to read just little portions of the novel, and to give you an idea of the sweeps. And what I'm trying to do, I try to incorporate my own personal history and my family's history, as well as a larger history that I'm just finding out, because I have to thank these incredible young historians who have gone into archival research and have, just one history book after another publishing. And then also for the veteranos like George Sanchez, who has worked on his book on Boyle Heights for 25, 27 years. And it's an incredible book. It's just an absolutely incredible book. And so these are the things that feed me. And I get very excited. But okay, I'm going to read from book one. And this is section 2, which starts on page 55. And it might give you some idea as to, how I'm doing the sweeps. And in book one, it's called, the book one is called The Surprise Trancazo. And each of the characters deals with their own personal trancazo, but then I'm looking at the bigger trancazo as Pearl Harbor, because that's when the US gets into the war. And one of the reasons why I started writing about the cemetery boys was because of my uncle, who my tío Kiko, who was in the Army before, they had a volunteer draft, and he was in the Army before Pearl Harbor. And then as soon as Pearl Harbor hit, he was shipped off to the Philippines and then ended up in Okinawa. He saw a lot of incredible carnage and returned home a struggling individual, but somebody who loved children. And so he was always around my mother's house, because my mother had enough children to, he and his wife never had children. And so he became one of my favorite uncles. So anyway, I felt that I wanted to insert his personal story, our personal story, into a larger story of World War II. So anyway, let me just read you this. And this one starts on page 55 of the novel. Book 1, Section 2. When the East Side Journal headline announced U.S. calls all reserves, the 10th and 11th calls were combined, and 700 local East Side boys, including the boy who had received his 1A Selective Service Classification postcard order number typed 691, were inducted into the Army by the local board number 203-191, Los Angeles County 037, in the month of June alone, 1940. Barely nuzzling mustaches, hardly embracing full romance, much less a hearty meal made with flour, beans, and beer stored in commodity barrels. The East Side boys traveled in bulk in caravan transports on grimy and desolate stretches of Route 66 to Camp Needles, close to the California-Arizona border, in such elevated desert temperatures, the heat pressed against their razored scalps. The hot seats shaved their fledgling scrotums. A nation on the move, the caravan transport was but one spoke in the expansive news reel, wheeling thousands and thousands of young men to various military camps and corps, away from their pueblos and townships and valleys and counties and Indian reservations and state lines. A promise to revise their unspectacular, hungry lives. The boys had reported for duty, carrying with them their meager possessions in used Army rucksacks, their repositories of habits inside their bedrolls, a neighbor's borrowed oilcloth valise, beaten suitcases reinforced with maga hemp containing family heirlooms, a wooden comb, a ribbon clip of a beloved's curl, grandpa's soiled Sunday missal. Some carried nothing more than a birth certificate inside a shoe repaired with a cardboard heel, while others saved a kidney stone keepsake, a Confederate uniform button stitched into the hem of a coat, a Union cap donned atop a hairful, necessities like a bent spoon inside a mended trouser pocket, fast available for staking grub. Newly inducted, newly scrubbed and sullen-faced, they journeyed from sea to shiny sea, and under dawn's early light and rapturous alabaster twilights, across fruited plains and flatland prairies where the deer and the antelope played. Ships assailed colossal oceans, planes impaled spacious skies, trains sallied through river bridges, looped around purple mountains' majesty, rose into pine forests thick with the scent that stuck like sap, crested the apex of ancient redwood, dense spruce, pinon, silver cottonwood, sloped down into the amber waves of grain and irretrievable hours of tumbleweeds tumbling, of high-rises scraping, of oil refineries and steel factories, their smokestack chimneys catching the gleam of morning's first beam. The boys had journeyed across the vast aboriginal inventory among the peaks and valleys of embattled legacies, between the limestone arrowheads and the recriminating echoes, the heat sizzling right through the very soles of their new ankle-laced military boots. They finally reached the last stretch of bushes stunted tightly to the rim of parched ravines, finally arrived at the watchtowers, the barbed wire fencing, the tar paper buildings, arrived in fin at the grammar and punctuation of basic training. And then I'm going to read one more. This particular section takes place in 1938 in the migratory corridor of California. And I always go back because, you know, the fields of California were just, wow. I mean, it was the cornucopia of dreams in the 1930s after the Great Depression. And so you have these incredible migrations going to California to try and find work, including the White Okies, which became the Jodes in the Grapes of Wrath. And the Jodes do make an appearance here, right after my Papa Felix. Anyway, I'm including all this. I feel I have to incorporate our stories because we were there, we existed, but also incorporate aspects of the American literary canon that refuse to acknowledge us. Okay, once when they reach their destination, say at the outskirts of the Ingram Farm in Poplar, perhaps Simi Valley's Apricot Ranch, or in Delano, where there might be vacancies in the government-sponsored Camp 101, the boy accompanied Pa to canvass for Harvest News, collect labor updates because winds of discontent, picket lines and police bulls, merciless deportation officers posed just as dangerous as the lawlessness of the fields where everyone worked in deep chilled mornings or under 3-digit degree sun beneath the radar of what was fair and safe. Like the other farm workers, the boy's family homesteaded for months in barns, slept in decrepit sheds, derelict houses, in makeshift migrant barracks, government camps, made homes under tarp tents along the highway, often toiling 14 summer hours at 10 cents an hour, 6 days a week. They knew aplenty about the heat, the swell of spider bites, relentless itch of bed bugs, of red ant bonsai, human nights that burglarize sleep, the violent crack of morning, the white clouds congealing like curdled clumps of rotten milk. Even after atole was served for breakfast, noisy intestines still bloated with complaining want. Even after a corn mesh gorda was devoured for dinner, the meals were barely insufficient at recruiting energy for another back-intensive day of picking seasonal fruit, harvesting annual vegetables. Pa paired up with his oldest, Sayula. The boy worked with his younger sister, Pomposa, and Ama held close to the baby, Adeleda. Camouflaged in long sleeves, gloves, rubber bands around their trouser ankles, their mouths and noses pressed under their bandanas, the boy's family appeared indistinguishable from the other farm workers, to the truck drivers who collected them before sunrise and drove them to a designated harvesting sites. At sunset, they still resembled one another as they emerged from the fields and orchards, clutching empty water bottles, holding a child's hand, their faces wrapped with the gauze of fine white dust under wide brim hats or bonnets, their shoulders harmed after laying out raisin grapes or stacking tomato crates, their backs damaged after hauling pounds of cotton or plucking tangerines and apples. The truck drivers returned them to their accommodations and they muttered gratitude in English tilted to a regional accent, removed their cachuchas and hats, dusted off the soil, wiped away sweat with a rag dipped in soapy water, and felt a fleeting, frugal renewal. At sundown, the kindling in the small portable stove cackling. Ama set to burning candles, to conjuring the mathematical sorcery necessary to find the extra meal inside the calculated equation of never enough. The boys in the other camps collected firewood, scraped the respective fire pit grates, raked the cinders clean. The girls in the other camps chucked the corn, boiled okra or nopal, measured the bacon grease, fetched water in the kettle. But the women in all the labor camps, labored the fields, baked the bread, rolled the tortilla, treated the lice, taught the alphabet, recited the prayers, repeated the folk tales, bathed the youngins, darned the socks, lifted the screeching, steamy kettles to brew teas for baby or spousal colic, for ridding earaches and backaches, for breech or birthing babies, for easing monthly cramping, cooling a woman's change, for burying buds not yet fully bloomed, each fireside glow casting shadows on their glistened grimaces, the dimming circle of cinder sputtering upon their glassy, exhausted eyes. Dishes cleaned, candles extinguished, the children cocooned atop corn husk beds, a weak drone of nocturnal insects over someone's harmonica bedtime tunes. The women waved their kerosene lanterns at one another, the lone lamplights like sparks of fireflies, the cold black night tightly wedged between them. I want to thank everybody for this incredible honor. And I fully embrace all of your words, your love in making this happen, but also the incredible amount of intellectual discussions and expressions that I saw with the presenters. I want to thank everybody, really from the bottom of my heart. This is a real memorable experience for me to share the Madrid keynote. Thank you. Oh, they're all waving. I'm waving back. No, I can't. It's pretty but I'm waving back. Love you guys. You guys are great. Thank you, Arturo. There you go. Hello, 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 hello. Yeah, there you go.
Comments? Yes, David.
No, I just wonder if you could talk a little more about this notion of being an interloper and what that means. I think a lot of us in our different identities feel like we are treading on ground that maybe we weren't invited to be on. And if you could talk a little more about what it means to be an interloper.
Could you hear the question, Helena?
Yes, I could hear the question, but I'll repeat what Mary Pat has described. I'll cross my arms and said, "What do you think?" What do you think, David? I mean, that's a very good question. What are you thinking? I mean, I know in your statement you were talking about the fact that you feel like an interloper. Can you tell us more about that?
Well,
okay, I'll just, you know, in my own personal experiences, I mean, being an interloper I realized I was the heretic. I mean, and that's what you have to, and that's what you have to be. When I went to UC Irvine, my experience in the MFA program there, when I first started in 1979. Now you have to remember we were just in this chaos of the war ending and of the women's movement, the Chicano movement, the Chicana feminist movement, the civil rights movement, all these movements going on. And so I was hyped to go to a school that would make me a better writer, because I realized I was writing about people that were my family, but then that also resonated with other people's family, primarily, other Chicanos and Chicanas. And so I wanted to write well. And what happened was that when I went there, and this is a story I've told over and over again in the AWP keynote a few years ago, I also mentioned it, but I write it all the time because I wanted to make sense of it. I really wanted to, I mean, these are things that really, and I left the program because my professor told me he was very frustrated with my work. He didn't, he didn't recognize it. He didn't recognize the structure I was using, and he didn't recognize the subject matter, which were my family, and he didn't recognize my class either, because he asked me at one point when I had turned in rowing, he asked me, he said, are these people really that poor that they can't afford that? And that was, finally, after much discussion, I was a student ready to be taught. I mean, I wanted to be a good writer. And but when he told me that that the trouble with my work is that I was writing about Chicanos, I should be writing about people. That's when I realized, wow, that's when I realized this is amazing. This person knows absolutely nothing about me. Now I know about Anglo culture because I was reading all these books, okay? And so I knew a little bit, but they knew nothing about mine, absolutely nothing about mine. And so I left the program. And I didn't return for over 10 years. I didn't return for over 10 years because of that. I mean, talk about being an interloper, but nonetheless, it just gave me more fuel and more inspiration. And I knew I wouldn't fail. And the reason why I knew I wouldn't fail was because it came from such a sense of love, that everything I did and how I worked and how I sweated over these stories that became the moths was really a profound sense of love that I felt for us as a community, and even a larger community, because as Edwidge Danticott said, I talk about trying to humanize my characters, and she talks about how when we do that as writers, we humanize the reader. So the reader benefits from it too, So, I mean, interloper, I was in, but I was not, when I understood the politics of how this country works, that's why I had to, when I'm talking about, well, who's the real interloper here? If we really switched the real history, then, the interlopers are the people who colonized the States, the people who colonized the Western Hemisphere. Those are the interlopers, But so I have to recognize that, So in a way, maybe I'm reclaiming, maybe it's a reclamation. I'm reclaiming that by inserting and by refusing to be invisible, by refusing to have my people be invisible, because you know what? I love that, and that's why when I talk about that young girl, and I did tell her, I said, oh, how loved you are, and she looked so sad, but yeah, she was loved, that she recognized that moment of grace, that yes, her family had come all the way. And it was just about an hour. And they had to make that trek back, you know, but that they were there. They were there. And she smiled, you know. And so, I don't know, I feel I can't go wrong. At the same time, I really feel like, and I'm excited to see these presenters and, you know, these incredible talks that we've seen about, you know, let's forget for a moment that it's not about me, but the incredible thoughtfulness and the beauty and the elegance of the way of their thinking. That makes me excited. I get very happy about that, you know. And if I have a small offer to offer these, I mean, I'm thankful. I'm thankful. But even if it wasn't me, there would be somebody else or something else that would create these incredible thinkers that we now have here. And it's something that we always have to recognize that, you know, this is what I love about doing these talks, because we recognize that we all have elders, you know, like Arturo Madrid, like Antonia Castaneda. And now I'm becoming an elder. I'm becoming an elder too. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I look back and I look at these younger presenters, these, you know, elegant thinkers, and there's this real sense for me of gratitude and happiness that I know that we'll be okay. I know, Gabi, that you said that things have not changed, but you're there. You're writing your poetry, you know, and you know, we're doing the work that we need to be doing. So things may not have changed in the big picture, but in our lives they have, and here in this moment they have. So, you know, we have to find that moment of grace. We have to find that moment of grace.
Anyone else, a comment or a question? Yes, Rita.
Rita!
Hola.
Hola.
I'm just really curious. This is just really out of curiosity. The title of your book, The Cemetery Boys, is very similar to Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas. Are you familiar with Aiden Thomas's book?
You know what? Let me tell you. I'm only familiar in the title, and I haven't. But I think it's very different because the Cemetery Boys deals with war, but also we find out in book 2 the reason why they're called the Cemetery Boys is because they live across the cemeteries. And so to identify them, they would say, "Oh, he lives across. He's a cemetery boy." So yeah. So what did you think about that, Rita?
I just think I love Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas, and I think once you read it, you'll see why it's such a wonderful novel. And it's about brujos, transgender brujos, right? In East LA. And so I just love the fact that both of these books have a related similar title, but of course very different, like you're saying. At the same time, I think it's wonderful that they're both highlighting LA and especially East LA. And so I wonder if Aiden Thomas knows about your book as well, so that they can you know, be familiar with such a wonderful writer such as yourself.
Well, Rita, tell that person, tell the author.
Haven't met them yet, but I wanted to thank you, Helena. It's so wonderful to have you here, and of course all the presenters.
Oh, Rita, I wish I was there to give you a hug.
All the presenters highlighting your work, and of course all in honor of our dear Dr. Arturo Madrid and our dear Antonia Castaneda. So mil gracias.
Go ahead, Arturo.
Helena, I resonated powerfully to your comment about looking for Mexican in John Steinbeck. And the only one I ever found was a little story about Monterey Bay area, and there were winos.
Cannery Road. Was it Cannery Road?
Winos. Then looking for Latinos elsewhere. Of course, Norman Mailer, there was a Chicano who was a medic. And that was the only Chicano I ever found in literature. Of course, in New Mexico, we had, of course, the representation in Death Comes to the Archbishop of Willa Cather, but otherwise, we were not there. We were absent.
And you know, it's interesting to note that Steinbeck, I mean, did a lot of why he did this, I don't know, but he did a lot of you know, he did a lot of journalistic research in the 1920s and 30s and published a lot of really interesting work, you know, on the farm workers and the farm working condition. So when he decided to write the Grapes of Wrath, he completely erased all the Mexicanos. He completely erased all the other nationalities. I mean, I just don't understand it. His excuse, of course, was that if he had written about the, you know, the BIPOC farm workors, then what would happen is that people would not be interested, and so that's why he made the story primarily an Anglo story. But it's devastating to me to be. It's the same thing with World War II documentary by Ken Burns. Everybody knows about the slap in the face that was, you know, and doing this immense documentary that never mentioned one Latino, not one. And that's when I really felt the need to write about my uncle, you know. And that's when I really felt that.
I don't see any other hand up. So oh, there's one more. Go ahead.
Hi, Viramontes. So happy to be speaking to you. I'm actually coming into San Antonio from the University of Houston. My name is Lorena Chalo, and recently my Mexican-American literature course, we just finished reading Under the Feet of Jesus, and they loved it. And next on the syllabus is Other Dogs Came With Them. But I just wanted to say how much your work has created and sparked such discussion for creativity and these racial, cultural, and political circumstances that still resonate with us today, at least, you know, today. So I'm pretty interested in Estrella and her relationship with her mother in the book. Does Estrella, is that character based off of anything in your life, or how much is Estrella's character based off of your personal life, if you want to share at all?
As they say, I'm an open book. But in fact, that's why I would never really write a memoir, because it seems like my all remembrances and memories that I find that hold on to me are those I put in my fiction. So, you know, to write a memoir I don't think I could do it. But I think that you know, when I come from a large family. Okay, and what would happen is that even though we lived in East LA, we had relatives in Fresno. And so my father, one summer came, my father would load us all up on his Ford pickup truck and then take us over to Easton, outside of Fresno, and we would pick grapes for the summer. We did that for several summers. And so you know, just that experience alone, I never forgot. I never forgot both the horrendous work of it, and I also never forgot the beauty of you know, seeing these orchards and seeing the sky. Remember, we come from the city, and for me, it was both. It was a very bittersweet situation. I got, and then, but you know, when I started writing Under the Feet of Jesus, I realized that you know, my experiences, of course, were not like the migrant experiences, but my husband, Eloy Rodriguez, who was the James Perkin Endowed Chair here at Cornell University, was a migrant farm worker from the time he was well, all I know is that his mother said that he supported the family by the time he was 12. And that's what he would do, was he was picking. And he would follow the crops all the way up until Michigan. And then save enough money for a semester of college. And that's the way he got himself through school. And so I his story is, of course, incredibly valuable to me and to everybody else. And in fact, I put him as Alejo, so that's why Alejo comes from Edinburgh, Texas. And becomes the love interest.
And I think when students read that, especially in Texas, a lot of them identify because of that location.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So does that mean that Alejo lives?
It's funny, but I don't know how many throughout the year, 27 years, how many people have asked me if Alejo lives, and really, that I don't know. That I really don't know. Although there was somebody who did an analysis of all of his symptoms and found that he didn't. But it's not me to make that decision. I mean, for me, it was just the celebration of Estrella in this incredible event. I mean, this goes on for pages of struggling to get her friend to get some medical help, And so that's why, for me, one of my favorite, there are two really, really favorite moments. One of them is when Estrella thanks Perfecto. I mean, that's a very touching moment for me. But the other one is when the two twins are looking out of the car and looking at Estrella as she comes out in the glass part. I mean, the sliding door opens up, and they think it's magic. So Estrella picks up on it and starts playing with them, And so they just think she's the most incredible, wonderful human being for being able to divide glass, break glass. And I really thought about it because I wanted something very special from their point of view, that they would see that she has done, rather than say she has done something, to recognize this incredible moment by having these two kids just admire her and get close to her, I thought that those are my favorite moments in the novel.
Thank you so much. I do want to say a few things in closing. The Madrid lecture, like I said at the beginning of the day, was the brainchild of Dr. Arturo Madrid, and I think it will continue to exist because of his passion and Trinity University's support for the endeavor. It's an unknown fact, perhaps, but Antonia, Arturo, and I meet early on and start planning for the next year. And so we're going to be doing that for next year's. It's always held in April, or it has been held in April. We may change it, we don't know. It has taken on different formats. We've had 12 poets from the Americas one year when Carmen Tafoya and Rosemary Catakalos gave the lecture, as well as having one speaker, like last year when we have Tino Villanueva, the poet. He was the artist who spoke. So every year, be on the lookout for something wonderful coming from the Madrid lecture. We have a new branding, we have a new logo, everything. So we're trying to make it into something that it persists, that is going to go on. And of course, honoring Helena this year has been just a dream. It's been a dream come true. Right before COVID, I was ready to go to Cornell for a conference that would be in honor of Helena Maria Viramontes.
That's right.
And we couldn't go. None of us could go because of COVID. So when I invited Mary Pat, it was like, would you come? Because I was going to go to your place. Now you need to come to this one. So I really think that this is kind of closing that circle. I'm sure you will be honored many more times and many more recognitions of your work. I can't wait for the new novel. That's so exciting. Just hearing those excerpts that you read are just amazing. So muchas gracias, Helena, for your work. for your elegance, for your passion, for all that you have done for Chicano and Chicana, and actually all kinds of writers as a professor, because I know you've had phenomenal students who have gone on to do phenomenal work. Gracias. And finally, yes. I want to thank the students who were introducing our speakers. They're members of the creative writing class that I teach here at Trinity in the Spanish department in modern languages. They were just thrilled, and some of them hung out throughout the whole thing. Some of them had to go to class or had to go to work or other things, but they were just phenomenal for the class. Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, without the speakers, we wouldn't have had the symposium. So gracias. Gabriela had to dash off. She's teaching a class in Seattle right now. She had to log on to teach her class. She'll be there for the dinner. I know. And Cordy, thank you for coming all the way from Lubbock. She drove in this morning. So gracias. Jodie from Kingsville. And Mary Pat, where are you? Oh, there you are. You're standing in the back. Muchas gracias to all of you. You were just brilliant. And I haven't planned it beyond saying that we might publish these pieces in a short kind of, I don't know what to call it, working paper or something. It's not really enough for essays for a book, but we will, I think, make it more permanent. The YouTube link is there for about, I think, 2 weeks. Is that true, Josh? Yeah, more or less. And so you can still access it. If you missed any of the talks, you can go in there and watch them, or share that you were here and saw this phenomenal thing happen and you want others to also watch it. I also want to thank Corinne Castillo, administrative assistant, who really did a lot of the work. Muchas gracias. And Trinity University Press, that's here in the back with books. We're going to do some book signing. If any of you have books that you want us to sign, we'll be there. And then we're going to convene, some of you have already RSVP'd for a dinner with the speakers. And I wish with Helena, we're going to have to bring you back so we can have dinner with you.
That would be lovely.
Muchas gracias a todos y a todas. And Arturo's waving and saying goodbye. Muchas gracias. Thank you for showing up, for staying with us throughout the day. And we'll keep seeing you, I'm sure. Hasta luego.
Hasta luego. Hasta luego.